Thanks for having me for Cocking Talks this evening. Um, as a few of you know, I have two jobs. One as your parish priest here, as well as at Hayshot and Bepton, and the other as a psychologist. But I'm not that kind of psychologist. I don't have a clinical or therapeutic practice of any kind, and am not qualified to do that sort of thing. Rather, I am a research psychologist and was trained more specifically as an experimental psychologist. The term experimental here refers to the method of research in which I specialize, namely experiments, which is partly what I want to talk about tonight. But first, let me introduce psychology more generally. Most textbooks will point out that the word psychology comes from the Greek word psyche, which is probably best translated soul, but which most people prefer to translate as mind. So psychology is the science of the mind. I don't think this is very helpful, as it leads to questions about what the mind is, and that's a can of worms I don't really want to open today. Ask me about that some other time, and I will tell you for a small fee. I think it's more useful to consider what it is that most psychologists working in university departments of psychology do all day, what they are interested in. Obviously, we are interested in all kinds of things. There are some psychologists who study romantic attraction. I wrote that sentence on St. Valentine's Day. And there are those who study traumatic experiences. There are those who study cooperation and conflict in groups, and those who study football fans. There are those who study the fear of death, and those who study religion. As it happens, I have myself worked on all these topics, and this is typical. Most psychologists are interested in a wide variety of phenomena. But what I think unites us and unites our own interests is a desire to explain why human beings are the way we are. Why do we behave the way we do? Why do we believe what we believe? Why do we feel the way we feel? There is a sense in which this obsession with explanation, with why questions, is true of all scientists, and for some of us, it is driven by sheer curiosity about the world, and for psychologists about the human bit of the world in particular. For others, this interest in what causes people to act or think or feel a certain way is motivated by a desire to change people's actions, thoughts, and feelings, hopefully for the better. Clinical psychologists, for example, rely on research about the causes of psychopathology in order to devise treatments to help people who suffer from various disorders. More nefariously, perhaps, marketing executives also increasingly consult psychological research to figure out how to shape consumer preferences. Ditto governments, hence the foundation some years back of the Behavioral Insights team, populated by psychologists, which has since spun off into a private enterprise. So, if psychology is about explaining human actions, thoughts, and feelings, then the psychology of religion is about explaining religious actions, thoughts, and feelings. Psychologists of religion want to know why people believe in gods and participate in rituals and have religious experiences. I used to make the mistake of telling strangers what I do for a living. And whenever I did so, I would be treated with their pet theory about why people were religious. Everyone has one, especially people I sit next to on long-haul flights. For a similar reason, I never wear my dog collar on flights. It's fine, obviously, to have your pet theories about why people are religious. I have mine too. The thing that sets a scientist apart from a random bloke on a plane is that the scientist is interested in testing their theories against empirical evidence. In some ways, that's really a job description for a scientist. It's our job to try to figure out how to test theories, whatever they may be about. Now, I shouldn't be so snobbish about strangers on planes, and really I'm not. I like to say that I'm a dinner party scientist. I like to talk to people at dinner parties and hear out their ideas, some of which are commonsensical, and others of which sound totally bonkers, and most of which are somewhere in between. And I like to then go away to think about how we might find out whether these ideas might be true or false. I did this a lot as a student at university, just as I was beginning my doctoral research. Of course, I would read what other psychologists thought and all that, but it was also interesting to me that pretty much everyone had a view about where religion comes from. Some people said that religion is a way to ward away the fear of death. Others said that it was driven by loneliness. Others still said that it was a sort of pre-scientific way to explain natural phenomena, or maybe a way to find meaning in the world more generally. Some people told me that they believed that once upon a time our ancestors smoked something interesting, had psychedelic experiences as a result, and bam, religion was born. I wrote all these ideas down and made a list, which looked a lot like this one, and I showed the list to my doctoral advisor, and I told him that I wanted to test all these ideas. How he laughed. By the end of my 3 years as a doctoral student, I'd hardly begun working on the first item on that list, whether the fear of death led people to become religious. A bit like Taskmaster, which I've been watching obsessively recently, I'm dividing this talk into 4 sections, the first of which you have just heard, introducing psychological science generally. The next 3 sections will cover the 3 basic methods available to psychologists, namely correlational, longitudinal, and experimental methods. I realize that the talk is called Experimenting with Religion, but I'm going to go broader than that. I'll give examples of these 3 methods mainly from my own work, but also those of others. The second section, which we're now beginning, will focus on correlational methods with a diversion about measurement. A correlation is a statistical relationship between 2 sets of numbers. Typically in science, the numbers represent some traits or states. For example, there is a strong positive correlation between a person's weight and their height. That is, people who are taller are usually also heavier. Now, this isn't always true. Of course, there are some people who are generous of mass but diminutive of stature, like myself on Pancake Day just passed. And then there are others who are tall and light, the bastards. These variations mean that the correlation between height and weight is not perfect. Very few correlations are. In fact, most real-life correlations are very weak. And this is because for any given outcome, whether it's religiosity or say cancer or IQ or weight loss, there are a myriad of factors at play, each of which only contributing a small part. The weight-height example is of a linear correlation, which just means that the best fit line that describes the general pattern of the statistical relationship is a straight line, as you can see in this picture. But not all statistical relationships are best described in linear terms. Some relationships, and thus correlations, are curved, and the simplest curve is a quadratic curve, either a U-shape or an inverse U-shape. Here is a hypothetical example of a U-shaped function. It is a parent's happiness level on the vertical axis and the number of nights on the horizontal axis. On the day or night before sleep training begins, the parent in question is more or less neutral. Nights 1 and 2 are really tough as the baby is crying all the time. By night 3, things get a bit better, but on night 4, the baby sleeps through the night and there is much rejoicing. I wrote that paragraph after a week of sleep training Casper, my 10-year-old. It actually went better than this graph implies, but that wouldn't make a very interesting illustration. Now here's a graph of an inverse U function. This graph represents the relationship between the profit margin set by a vendor on the horizontal and the total profit they make on the vertical. At first, the higher the margin, the more they make, which makes sense. But then, if the vendor gets too greedy and sets the margin too high, consumers get fed up and shop elsewhere or give up on the product altogether. So sales decline and total profits follow suit. That's enough statistical background. On then to death and religion. On the assumption that religious belief is at least sometimes motivated by the fear of death, we might expect some measurable relationship between these 2 traits, the fear of death and religiosity. We might, for example, expect people who are more afraid of death to also be more religious. This would be a positive correlation between religiosity and death anxiety. On the other hand, if religious beliefs are effective at reducing the fear of death, perhaps the more religious someone is, the less fearful of death they will become. and this would be a negative correlation. It is at this point unclear which of these options we should prefer, or indeed whether we need to choose between them at all. We will return to this question later. For now, we have a pretty straightforward research question. What, if any, is the statistical relationship between the fear of death on one hand and religious belief on the other? And to answer this question, we need to measure both traits, the fear of death and religiosity, and then we can run a correlational analysis on them. And by measure here, we mean pretty much what we normally mean, which is to quantify something, to turn something into numbers. Some things are pretty easy to quantify. Profit, for example, as we have just seen, as money is already quantitative. Things would be a bit more difficult if we still lived in a bartering economy. We would then have to turn objects into numbers. Other things seem harder to quantify. Happiness, perhaps, as in the sleep training example earlier, might be one of these, as are other emotions like fear and the fear of death specifically. The problem isn't so much that emotional experiences are subjective. All our subjective experiences come with objectively measurable manifestations. The most obvious of these are our behaviors. Most of the time, when we have an experience, whether it's an emotion or a thought, it affects the way we behave, whether deliberately or automatically, consciously or unconsciously. But there are also bodily changes that occur whenever we have experiences that are not quite behaviors as such. All psychological states correspond to some physiological and especially neurophysiological state. So, at least in theory, we can measure subjective psychological experiences by measuring such physiological activity. I say in theory because this is much trickier in practice. We do not yet have reliable physiological measures for psychological states and traits, certainly not for complex ones. Even after decades of research and development in neuroscience, the best way to find out what someone thinks or how they feel is to ask them. But this too is fraught with problems. There are basically three kinds of problems with asking people about their thoughts and feelings. The first is that people sometimes lie. They might not want to tell us whether they believe what they believe or how they feel, for whatever reason. Usually it's because they're embarrassed. Maybe people don't want to admit that they're afraid of death. They want to appear brave. The second problem is that people sometimes don't know what they think or how they feel. And this might be because their thoughts and feelings are ambiguous or subtle, or it may be because they are unconscious. Not the people, I mean the beliefs and the feelings. Maybe people don't realize that some part of them actually does believe in God after all, even though they think of themselves as atheists. The third problem is less straightforward and has to do with what we think traits are in the first place. Roughly speaking, psychologists think that traits are tendencies or dispositions to speak, act, and feel in particular ways. A helpful analogy here is to think of the difference between a symptom and the underlying medical condition. A trait is like a medical condition that manifests in particular ways. The trouble is that, like some medical conditions, traits sometimes manifest in different people in different ways. Some people who are afraid of death really dislike funerals. Others don't mind them, but really dislike visiting people who are dying. Some religious people love going to church. Others prefer to find God in nature. This makes measurement difficult because it's hard to know what to look for when we're looking for clues, for symptoms of underlying traits like death anxiety and religiosity. Now, ideally, we would measure psychological traits by following people around and observing how they respond in relevant situations. We would watch whether people feel queasy in cemeteries and listen in on their prayers. But we can't do that because it's creepy and resource intensive. So, for better or worse, what most psychologists do is ask questions. Or more commonly, we present people with statements and ask about the extent people agree with them. There is a long and quite tedious process of how these statements are drafted and tweaked and tested and retweaked, but I won't bore you with that. What I will bore you with, instead, is a sense of what a good psychological measure is and how we might find out whether any given measure is any good. This is the supernatural belief scale. I designed it some years ago to measure people's tendency to believe in what we called supernatural agents, entities, and events. This scale contains 6 statements, each representing a kind of supernatural belief that happens, for whatever reason, to be rather common across cultures. This instrument was intended to be useful all around the world across religious traditions and has now been translated in 17 languages. Lots of cultures have this idea of a supreme or high god, even so-called polytheistic religions like Hinduism do. And lots of cultures have the idea of lesser deities or divinities, even the traditional monotheisms do. The idea of a soul is pretty universal as far as we can tell, as is belief in an afterlife and the belief in a realm of existence apart from this one. And the idea of miracles is pretty common too. These are not the only cross-culturally recurring religious ideas, but I didn't want to have too many items, so these are the ones I chose. Now, remember that I'm not really interested in people's particular beliefs in any one of these supernatural things. What I'm trying to do instead is to get at an underlying tendency. So how can I know whether this measure is any good? Well, first we have to say what it means for a measure to be any good. What we basically want is an instrument that measures what we intend to measure and to do so reliably. Consider Mary Poppins' tape measure. This is not a valid measure of height, as it seems to measure something else altogether. But nor would the tape measure on the right, made of icing, work, despite having numbers on it, as it wouldn't be reliable on account of being stretchy. Reliability is reasonably easy to assess. If a trait is stable, then the measure should produce more or less the same score each time. So if someone completes my supernatural belief scale twice, 2 weeks apart, I would expect them to have very similar scores each time, unless they had had an epiphany between the 2 sessions. Validity, which is that thing of measuring what it purports or intends to measure, is trickier. What you first need is some theory of what people who possess this tendency to believe in supernatural things are like. Then you can see if this measure predicts those expected outcomes. I said earlier that the 6 items in the supernatural belief scale are not the only supernatural beliefs that are common across cultures. An example that was not in the set might be the belief that in human intermediaries of spiritual power or authority, such as shamans or priests or prophets. If someone has a tendency towards supernatural beliefs, they should, all else being equal, be attracted to this idea too. So we can check to see if people's scores on my instrument here predicts that specific belief as well. We can also see if their scores can be used to predict other behaviors associated with supernatural belief, such as prayer or religious service attendance or whatever. And the better the measure is at predicting the sorts of things we might expect, the more likely it is to be a valid measure. As far as we can tell with the research that has been conducted already, the supernatural belief scale performs fairly well. But we need another measure too, if we're going to look at the relationship between this trait and death anxiety. And so here is the existential death anxiety scale. It's called the existential death anxiety scale because it's concerned with a specific kind of death anxiety, which is the fear of not existing. This is, for example, distinct from the fear of the dying process, whether or not it will hurt, or whether they will be lonely when it happens. I designed this one too, and it's not been used as widely as the supernatural belief scale, but it's also been translated a few times and works pretty well. Now recall that what we want to know is whether there is some kind of relationship between religiosity and the fear of death. Are religious people more or less afraid of death than atheists, for example? What we need to do then is to give a whole bunch of people at least these 2 scales, but probably ask them also other questions, like about their age, or their gender, or their socioeconomic status. And the reason we should ask questions like these is that we want to control for them statistically to make sure that whatever relationship we do find between these 2 traits is not actually a coincidence caused by their relationship with other traits. For example, if older people are more religious than younger people, and also more afraid of dying, then that might explain a positive relationship between religiosity and death anxiety. The 2 would not be directly related, but only indirectly because of this 3rd trait, age. So that's what we did. We collected responses from hundreds of people in a dozen or so countries, not just on these two measures, but on others besides. And then we ran some statistical analyses on them. We first looked to see if there was a linear relationship between the two, and there wasn't. So we checked to see if there might be a curved relationship, and there was, but quite a weak one. Basically, people who believed very strongly and disbelieved very strongly in supernatural things enjoyed lower levels of death anxiety than people in the middle, the agnostics and nominally religious folk among us. Next, then, we need to think about what this result might mean. There are at least two ways of interpreting this graph. The first is to say that it doesn't matter what you believe, as long as you believe it strongly. That will help to reduce your fear of death. And that makes a certain amount of sense. The second is more complicated and divides the graph into two halves. It's easier to begin on the right-hand side. This graph focuses on the believers. For them, the more they believe, the less they fear death. The left-hand graph focuses on non-believers, but this time we tell a different causal story, and say that the more someone fears death, the more tempted they are to believe. So for this half of the graph, we are saying that the fear of death is the cause of the religious belief increasing. But for the other half, we are saying that the religious belief is the cause of the fear of death decreasing. Now this switching back and forth between causes and consequences in our interpretation of the results is possible because correlations don't tell us which trait is the cause and which trait is the effect, or indeed whether either trait is affected by the other at all, or whether there is a third trait affecting them both at the same time that we didn't manage to measure or control for. So we have learned something from this study, but there are questions remaining, and that might compel us to run a different kind of study. There are two broad ways in which scientists discover the causes of things. The first is to observe things over time, to document the chronology of changes. For something to be a cause of an effect, it has to precede it in time. This kind of study is called a longitudinal study. The second is to directly intervene and to run an experiment. But we will start with longitudinal studies in part 3 of this talk. The most straightforward kind of longitudinal study is what is sometimes called a natural experiment, which is an experiment that nobody deliberately runs. This is the sort of thing that happens when, for example, a major event like a natural disaster or a terrorist attack strikes. If we have data from before the event, as well as data from after it, we can see the effects of the event by comparing the before and the after. That's the sort of thing that this graph illustrates, with the T representing the major event. And indeed, some of my colleagues and collaborators have found that there are interesting causal relationships between religion and such traumatic events as the 9/11 attacks in New York and the major earthquakes in Christchurch, New Zealand. In the Christchurch case, they found that people who lived in Christchurch began attending religious services more after experiencing the earthquake, whereas this did not happen elsewhere in the country among people who were ostensibly less affected by the earthquakes in Christchurch. They did not find much by way of psychological benefits of this increased participation, though there was some evidence that those who stopped going to church and other services after the earthquakes did also subsequently fare more poorly. So there was a sort of mental health cost to religious decline. The picture in the 9/11 case is slightly different. Other people before this team had found some slight evidence for at least a temporary uptick in religiosity after the 9/11 attacks. But this paper here additionally found that a person's religiosity prior to the 9/11 attacks acted as a buffer against the negative mental health effects of experiencing those attacks. And taken together, these studies find that religion is probably both affected by traumatic events and also affects people's responses to such events. My own contribution to this literature takes a different strategy. Rather than looking at one single large-scale event that affects entire cities and countries, my colleagues and I zoomed in onto the individual level and looked at data on negative experiences and health crises, such as bereavements, financial difficulties, and health crises, and so forth. We did not collect the data ourselves. In fact, I was only a teenager when the relevant data were collected. All the way back in 1972, over a decade before I was born, a group of scientists in the city of Dunedin in the south of New Zealand persuaded a large proportion of all the pregnant women that year to sign up to a longitudinal study. And over the years, these mothers, and crucially their children, now adults with children of their own, have returned over and over and over again to participate in the Dunedin study. As it happens, when the kids were 26 years old, and again when they were 32, the researchers around at that time asked them questions about their religious behavior. Bearing in mind that this study was never intended to be about religion, it is very lucky that we have religiosity data not once but twice. Even luckier, the researchers also asked questions about negative life experiences when the participants were 32, and they asked specifically about experiences that had occurred since the previous round when they were 26. So just by coincidence, we had exactly what we needed to look at the before and after effects of negative life experiences on religiosity. The results were quite complicated to analyze, as participants were asked about a whole host of different kinds of experiences. This is, as I said, different from the 9/11 and earthquake cases, which each only involved a single incident. Given my own interest in death, we decided to distinguish between death-related events and non-death-related events. To compare the two, the death-related events were mostly bereavements, the loss of loved ones. The non-death-related events were more diverse and included divorces, imprisonments, and illnesses. It was quite difficult to pick the events, actually. First, they had to be comparable in terms of emotional intensity, which, as it happens, there is independent data about from other people. But also serious injuries and illnesses, which we categorized as not death-related, is ambiguous in this regard, as they might, obviously, involve elevated risk of death. Anyway, after a lot of discussion among ourselves and with other people, we made the decision we made and we ran the analyses. And what we found was that while just experiencing more negative life events in general had no effect on religiosity, experiencing death-related life events specifically did increase certain aspects of religiosity. We also found that the effects varied from person to person, depending on how religious they were to begin with. Religious people began to pray more, but they didn't start going to church more after experiencing these death-related negative events. And non-religious people, in contrast, didn't begin to pray more, but did begin to attend church more. By the way, this picture here is not an accurate representation of what our data looked like. In fact, it's an accurate representation of no existing data at all. Real scientific data is actually quite messy and looks a little bit more like this. And even this is randomly generated data, but it shows two hypothetical variables correlated at about 0.3. The maximum correlation is 1. And 0.3 is higher than the average correlation in the psychological and social sciences. What you can see in this picture is like a best fit line in red that goes right through the dots. But without it, you can barely discern what the pattern is supposed to be. Now here's some real-world data, which is among the strongest correlations that exist in general, which is between height and weight, mentioned earlier. The correlation is around 0.5, again, out of 1 in real life. Now in this picture, even without the red lines, you can see much more clearly the direction of the correlation, but even here the pattern is still not at all like the beautiful straight line we saw earlier, which you see at the bottom of the screen, even with these two outliers that I've placed there. Right, so now we have two bits of evidence. First, a correlation between death anxiety and religion, which was causally ambiguous, and also at the bottom of the screen, some evidence that actually death-related experiences affected both religious and non-religious people, but in slightly different ways. But as we didn't collect this data ourselves, we didn't get to choose the measures used in this study. No measures of belief were included, for example. And so it's possible that non-religious people start to attend services more after bereavements, but don't begin to adopt the relevant religious beliefs. After all, people go to church for all sorts of reasons, belief being only one among them. And this is the trouble with natural experiments, and more generally with longitudinal studies that were designed by other people a long time ago. Of course, I could design my own longitudinal study, but A, this is incredibly expensive and effortful to do, and B, I might only find the results I'm looking for 30 years later, and I am not a patient man. So most of us analyze existing data collected by other people. Besides the Dunedin study, I'm also involved with the Avon longitudinal study of parents and children, which recruited tens of thousands of expectant mothers in 1991 and have followed many of them since. I'm running a version of this negative life experiences study on that dataset too, and with my colleagues we will look at all sorts of other things, including, for example, the relationship between childhood IQ and adult religiosity, and also the factors that lead to successful intergenerational transmission of religious beliefs from parent to child. Anyway, all of this is by way of introducing experiments as a method of studying religion, and that's what the fourth and final section of this talk will be about. The experiment is the poster child of science, and every school child is now taught the basics of its logic, first formalized in the Middle Ages, but thoroughly championed in the 18th century scientific revolution. The key idea in experimentation, which sets it apart from all other forms of scientific observation, is manipulation. This word has nefarious connotations, but all scientists mean is that we are intervening, introducing something new into the system that we are studying. Whether this is the nucleus of an atom, or a petri dish full of bacteria, or a group of human beings. The petri dish is the prototypical example of an experimental context. Most people are familiar, again from school, with the example in which there are two identical petri dishes filled with identical nutrients and then populated with identical bacteria, which are then allowed to grow and grow and grow until they have colonized the petri dish. Then, one dish is doused with penicillin, but not the other. A few days later, the bacteria in the dish with the penicillin are found dead, whereas the unmolested colony continues to thrive. Every experiment obeys this same logic. They take two things, ensure that they are similar as possible prior to the intervention, then they introduce the intervention to one but not the other, and then they observe the results. Whatever resulting differences we can see can be reasonably attributed to the intervention by elimination, as there were no other differences between them that can account for the change. Experimentation on inanimate physical matter and on simple organisms like bacteria is considerably easier than experimentation on human beings. Among the reasons for this is that thing of keeping all the samples identical prior to the intervention. That's very easy to do with bacteria, because each bacterium in a colony is essentially a clone of the other. Bacteria reproduce asexually, essentially by duplicating themselves, genes and all. Clones are very often used in research, even beyond bacteria. So-called lab rats, mice actually, are also usually clones to ensure genetic consistency between samples. We can't do this with humans, both for practical as well as for moral reasons. All we can do is to recruit our samples carefully, so that each group of people in the experiment are matched with one another. The trouble, of course, is that there are millions of potential differences between people, and it's very difficult to know what to match the samples on. In most psychology experiments, for example, a person's height might not matter, but depending on the task, their handedness might. Sex probably does matter in many psychology experiments, as does cultural background. And if the experiment is about religion, a person's religious background is probably also relevant. We might want a mix of religious and non-religious people, for example. So psychologists try to match for these sorts of things, depending on what the purpose of the experiment is. It is not an easy thing to do, especially considering that we need people to volunteer to participate in experiments, at least since the Geneva Convention. Even paid participants have to agree to do it in the first place. And there's no way to guarantee that the participants we need are the participants we can get. And if not, it's not entirely a disaster, as they are sophisticated statistical techniques that can help to ameliorate the effects of sample biases, but it's not an ideal situation. Even with perfectly matched samples, The other problem with experimenting with humans is that there is a limited range of things that we can practically and morally do to them in terms of interventions. We can, if we are asked very nicely, ask people to take penicillin or some other drug. Pharmaceutical companies are constantly running randomized control trials like this, which is what they call experiments. And that's how we know how effective and safe things like vaccines are before rolling them out to the general public. And we can get people to do blind tests of various products to see which they prefer. Marketing teams and consumer psychologists do this all the time. But what if we're interested in something like the fear of death? The ideal experiment test our hypothesis is to take a bunch of human clones, bring them up under very similar physical and social conditions, and then, when they are of whatever age we're interested in, fill half of them with mortal terror, to see that if that half end up more religious than the other half. We might, for example, falsely, of course, inform that they have contracted an incurable and fatal disease, or that they have just accidentally ingested poison, or we could throw them off the roof of a tall building, but of course with a big net at the bottom, because we don't actually want to kill them, as that would be wrong, but also we would not be able to ask them our questions if they were dead. Or we could play the long game and raise half the clones in such a way that they end up being neurotic about their mortality. We could teach them, perhaps by example, usually the best way, that death is something most to be feared. And then years later, we can see if that produces adults who are also more religious. None of this is possible, and so psychologists have to find ways to put people in a temporary and relatively mild state of death anxiety to see how they respond to that. The standard way to do this is just to get people to spend a few minutes thinking and writing about their own mortality, imagining that they are dying and indeed that they are dead. Participants are asked to describe what they think happens to their bodies after they die and to immerse themselves in how that makes them feel. That's the standard intervention. But every experiment also needs a control, which matches the intervention in some way. As we are getting these participants to think and write about death for, say, 10 minutes, we might want to get the control participants to think and write about something else for the same duration. Think back to the Petri dish experiment. If we are dousing one bacterial colony with penicillin that has been dissolved in water, we might want to douse the other with just plain water, just to make sure that it's not the water that's killing the bacteria, but the penicillin itself. It's just the same here. We want to make sure that it's the deathy bit of the task that makes the difference, not just spending time contemplating any old thing. So that's roughly the experiment we ran, which allowed us to see how religious and non-religious people would respond to contemplating their mortality. And what we found was this. Though again, this graph is for illustrative purposes rather than reflective of the actual figures. Obviously, religious people, the two bars on the left-hand side, mainly Christians in our sample in New Zealand, religious people scored higher on average on our measure of belief than non-religious people, the two bars on the right. And these people identified mainly as no religion, but also some identified as atheist or agnostic. Now, besides this obvious difference between people who identify as religious and non-religious respectively, we also found that the effects of the manipulation of thinking about death differed between these religious and non-religious folk. For religious people, thinking about death increased their belief compared to those religious people who were not given that task, who were given another task that was more benign. But for non-religious folk, thinking about death and writing about their death increased their disbelief, or reduced their belief, if you like. In other words, thinking about death led people to dig their heels into the ground, into whatever direction they were inclined to in the first place. The result is consistent with one of our earlier interpretations of our correlational study, which said that it doesn't matter what people believe as long as they believe it with fervor. Here, it seems that both religious and non-religious people treat their belief and disbelief a bit like a comfort blanket, running to these beliefs when they are confronted with their own mortality. But this experimental finding is also somewhat at odds with our longitudinal study, which found that even non-religious people became a tad more religious after undergoing a death-related set of experiences. So we have a new puzzle. What explains this contradiction? And this is very normal in science. New findings almost always lead to more questions. There seems to be a conspiracy in the universe to keep scientists in perpetual employment. And indeed, more people have worked on this question since I did about a decade ago now, which is a long time in science. This experiment is actually only one of 3 in the same paper, but I won't say anything about them right now because my intention in this talk is not really to delve deep into the specific question of whether the fear of death motivates religious belief. Rather, what I had hoped to do is to give some sense of how questions like that, and really any questions about the causes of religious belief or indeed disbelief, are approached by psychological scientists. As you can imagine, and as I alluded to earlier, there are lots of ideas that can be tested about where religion comes from and what its effects might be. And since the 1990s, more and more social and psychological scientists have been working on questions like these using methods I described here: correlational, longitudinal, and experimental. Some time ago, I gave a series of lectures on the broader context of this work, including some historical context too. And if you're specifically interested in psychology experiments, including more stuff about death, but also say experiments involving psychedelic drugs or cloned hamsters or love spells, then my publisher would be cross with me if I did not try to sell you this surprisingly affordable and moderately attractive looking book. I would be remiss also not to now tell you when our Easter services are for Holy Week, for Palm Sunday, Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter. So there you have it. And thank you very much for having me.